Hello, everyone. So, Fowler, do you want to give us the introduction to this because you filed it?
Gist of it, if that makes sense.
So just because I'm generally a fan of the template method pattern, would there be value in having the property enforce memoization that once the connection ID is queried, it can't change, or should it just be full virtual and it can be dynamic?
Good question. So what came up for Quick is that Quick can change the ID throughout the connection lifetime. I don't want to say that we have tried that. That currently what we do is that we actually cache the ID, but it's not a guarantee as part of the API. And I don't know if this ID might map one-to-one to the Quick ID. That may require more design. So I'm not sure if that needs to be a requirement that it can't change.
Yeah,
but in theory, yeah.
I mean, my quick take on that, David, tell me if you agree, is that having a connection ID mapped to the Quick ID and therefore change is probably not ideal for the user trying to track these things and observing a connection ID changing. I think that, and plus Quick can actually have multiple connection IDs at the same time. So my guess is that this connection ID is completely different than the Quick connection ID, and therefore we should probably say, yes, it cannot change on a given connection instance, that it's expected to remain the same.
Yep. Okay. That sounds good.
So one way to enforce that would be have a non-virtual property that does as its in its get calls a virtual thing once, and once it's not null, it won't ever ask again, and then that would let the base class enforce the contract.
Yeah. So you have a create ID that returns string, and this would be non-virtual. That seems fine.
Yeah, or protected virtual string get connection ID or whatever that gets called by this property setter or getter once as a memoization. So.
Yep.
Yeah.
What's the domain in which this ID is unique? Like, is it unique app-wide per transport? Okay.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily like the inbox versions might have some uniqueness. Like for instance, if we're using Quick, we might put a connection ID, but I don't know if there's a guarantee of uniqueness. This is mainly intended like it will probably be unique for the user, at least unique enough to use to correlate logs.
Okay.
Yeah, there might even be some transports that intentionally reuse IDs, not at the same time, but like if you think about sockets, well, one thing, we're not going to do this, but we could say, hey, we'll just expose the FID here. and the PID, of course, can be reused. We could also expose, the socket pair, source and destination IP and port, which gets a little wordy, but would actually be useful in some ways. But again, that can be reused over time.
Right.
I don't think this is a strict uniqueness guarantee. It's really for tracking purposes, and we should make it as friendly as possible in terms of like not just reusing these, trying to avoid that, but it's not the worst thing in the world if occasionally that happens.
Sure, that's fine. The reason I asked is because I can imagine like somebody trying to keep track of all of the outstanding connections for their application, and they might shove this in a dictionary keyed by connection ID.
Yep. So we had this discussion yesterday because Kestrel does something exactly like that, but we don't use connection ID. We use an internal long that we create just because we don't want to rely on that guarantee. The connection ID is used mostly for logging.
The name should probably reflect that then if it's really meant for logging purposes.
Correlation ID.
Sure, yeah. I mean, it's just whenever we have something called ID hanging off of an object, there's generally an expectation I can use that as a key somewhere.
Yeah.
So here's a question.
Trace ID.
Hold on. So can we guarantee it be unique within a transport then? For a transport, we won't reuse IDs.
What's that mean?
The
I don't understand what a transport means.
Sorry, the thing that produces these, either the
connection
factory or the factory, will make sure that those are unique and never reuse.
So the socket connections would all be distinct for distinct sockets, but it's potentially the TLS stream connection may use an overlapping ID inadvertently. Like if they just did, a static plus to figure out what their ID was.
Yeah, if you had like two different transports or something like that.
Yeah, so TLS on top of a socket would be two different things. And
I don't think so. That shouldn't change actually, because you want to correlate between those two things. All right.
Well, but TLS ID 1 and socket ID 1 aren't necessarily the same thing.
Right. Like if you're layering a TLS connection on top of a TCP connection, each of those connection objects would have separate IDs.
Well, in today's world, in Kestrel, that's not entirely true. So like when you wrap a connection, we forward the connection ID. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you actually want the same ID in that case, because you want to correlate logs all the way back to the transport through a TLS to the request.
I can see middleware appending to the connection ID. Maybe it doesn't today, like in the middleware that we write. But
so I guess
like for diagnostics,
it could.
So something like passive FTP, where you are reusing a thing for temporary subconnections, like would that be the same ID for all subconnections, or a concatenation? Or I'm just trying to figure out. I thought I understood it basically that everybody could use an implementation of GUID.NewGUID.toString as their default and be happy, but not necessarily useful. But if they're supposed to be correlatable, then it sounds like you really just want the full tracing notion of who's my parent and where did I come from, when did I, etc. And which maybe that means that this can be completely unrelated and you just throw it through the tracing ID of a new scope.
Yeah, so I think the issue with that, with trying to enforce that hierarchy, is you may want to represent an ID that you have already from the underlying transport. So you want to surface it somehow, right? It does feel wrong to me, and I haven't thought through this part, like having a different ID per middleware as it wraps connections feels wrong to me. That's actually the opposite of what I think you want. So
right.
I feel like yeah.
Most middleware forwards like all connection properties unless it has a reason to otherwise. Like obviously if you're doing TLS, you wrap the pipe or the stream. But you generally forward like all the connection properties. In this case, like connection ID, you would probably be forwarded in the most cases.
So I think it makes sense to if you want to change the ID, you can at that level. But I think by default, what we would say is you actually want to preserve the idea of what came from the transport and to flow it all the way up the stack.
Okay. Does connection base know about a connection it's stacked on top of? Like, does it have that as a
It does not.
property? Okay.
No.
So we can't provide a default implementation that does that, but
No. So question then, like, would we default to GUID.NewGUID as a lazy thing?
I don't see why not.
I like that.
I think it's a fine thing to have as the base implementation of the virtual. You get an ID, and
I mean, we could just easily use an incremented number, right? I think so long as we try to guarantee some uniqueness within the process, I think we'll be okay.
Yeah, you generally, if this could end up being exposed to the user, generally you don't want to use incrementing numbers because it discloses information about how active your website is. But yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, I mean, this is intended for diagnostic purposes, so I don't know that it's something that we would need to.
Yeah, if it's
Something
only
that
in
would
the
never be
activity log,
exposed.
I don't.
Yeah, if you have a pretty good feeling that it's only going to end up in the activity log, then it doesn't matter. But if there are scenarios where it could get exposed to the user, just consider it. And by user, I mean end client.
Yeah, so like something went wrong with request ID 4. Like,
so I mean that does happen, right?
Indeed.
Well, at least today in ASP.NET, we actually show an ID on the error page by default. So that is a thing to consider.
But yeah. So GUID, new GUID, 2-string, or this is the same if this is for 5, you could just make it abstract and make everybody think about it. But
I like the GUID, new GUID. It makes, I mean, either
Microsoft, we love GUID.
Either's fine.
Well, what is the scenario then for not using GUID, new GUID? Like, in other words, why would I override this?
If you were going to expose the underlying transport, so the WebSocket transport runs on top of ASP.NET Core and will expose the request ID as the ID.
I see.
As one example of more they have.
All right. I think we beat this horse to death.
Yeah, I think there's some on the new GUID thing. I do think there's some, like, incrementing numbers are easier to use than GUIDs.
Yeah.
Maybe we don't care that much, but it's, the way it works today in ASP.NET, it's a lot easier to see like connection 0000003 or whatever it comes up as if you're doing testing, as opposed to FA69 whatever,
Yep.
Maybe we don't care about that, but it,
That's a good point. I think I prefer incrementing numbers for exactly that reason.
Yeah.
Given the choice.
So just so everyone knows, ASP.NET basically has like an alphabet that's like 32 characters, and we just increment a number and format the long as that number, as that text.
Yeah, I saw that, but like,
hex,
why?
Not quite base 64.
What? Isn't it base 32? I don't even know.
Probably.
Yeah, it's base 32.
So like, but why did you do that? Why did you just literally print the number?
Because we're computer scientists and make things difficult.
Yeah, I looked at this and I'm like, well, I don't know why you go out of your way to make that harder to read.
Fixed width identifier, emo, fixed width.
I guess.
I don't know. We did it that way.
I mean, I will say though, like,
long decimals are hard to read.
I mean,
not saying base 32 is a lot better, but
the text.
I mean, I will say like there is some advantage of not using an auto-generated number, and that is you don't violate people's aesthetics after the fact, right? You basically make it so that it's always some hashy-looking number, and then you're just used to that idea, right?
It's nice. Yeah, because we basically have an ID for connections that is increasing, and then we have the request ID be a number off of that. So we have like the ID for the connection plus the number of requests over that connection as the ID by default. Sorry, Levi. It's leaking a ton of information to people, but super nice.
I mean, the other thing.
Document it.
Yeah.
The other thing with numbers is people will predict them, right? So if it's always a GUID or some weird looking number, it's hard for people to predict the next number. So
Right.
it's hard for you to
That's-
depend on that behavior.
That's a double-edged sword, which was, I think, Levi's point of if it's predictable, then maybe there's a way to use that to your advantage if it's being reported to you, and if it's not, then you can't. But it really depends on scenarios. If the scenario's logging in diagnostic flow and it seems unlikely that this is what someone would choose to return on an error page or whatever without them having to find the ID of their own model, then locking while bumping a static seems fine.
So performance-wise,
Sorry, using a GUID also seems kind of in conflict with the idea that we want to allow at least some providers, although not the default providers, to provide their own connection ID, right? Because, if any provider can just walk up and provide their own connection ID, then whatever we're trying to accomplish by using GUIDs is kind of out the window in terms of predictability or uniqueness guarantees or anything else.
Right. Well, that's if you didn't think about it. It's just make sure that if you're doing the minimum amount of work that you're not in a bad state is the idea of the GUID to me. But
Yeah, so do we want to prescribe the GUID then, or are we saying like whatever you guys want to return? Because I don't care that much, to be honest. Like that's more of a networking concern than it is an API concern.
Indeed, from an API perspective, it doesn't really matter from the security perspective, since many of us are in the same can just change hats while being in the same room. We've said the concerns, and I don't think we have a block on anything. But being virtual and having a default implementation is the API concern, and after that, do the memoization thing.
Yep.
Are we happy with the name then? Connection ID?
I love it. Perfect.
I like it.
Wonderful.
Related to the generating the default value or the base implementation here, one issue that came up previously is if we're auto-generating stuff for people, and if it's GUIDs, it doesn't matter, right? Because GUIDs are always unique. But if it's an incrementing number, then the question is, what's the scope of that number, right? Is it per transport or is it global?
Yeah, true. Yeah, because then the ID can't come from the actual base if it's per transport. Right.
I mean, if you own all the transports, it just means that you need to come up with something different, or.
But we don't.
So maybe it makes sense to default to GUID.new GUID in the base, because that's unique globally, and then a transport can choose to override it and increment IDs.
I mean, you can also do a concurrent dictionary of type to long. Just saying, that's how you do generic without generic. What's my type? Look it up in a dictionary.
Or, one thing we talked about briefly here is just use get hash code. If you've got get hash code, then you've got something that's relatively unique.
Get type, get hash code is the upper 32 bits, and the I don't know that you'd want to increment as the bottom, but yeah, whatever. Anyway,
I think I'd be happy if we just use a global static, not per transport integer that we just increment. I don't know if this even matters for this group. It seems implementation, not API, but yeah.
I will say that Jan showed me how to make interline increment super slow, so now I'm scared of it. But aside.
Like how to make it slow? What? Just make it contended?
A ton of contention that makes it horribly slow.
Sure.
You can use some TLS for that.
Yeah.
All right. So
then I think there's one other API issue here that's related to this, which is that we have there's actually the typical way you get a connection is either from a connection factory or a connection listener. But you can also create a connection directly from, there's statics that are connection.fromStream and connection.fromPipe that allow you to create a connection without going through one of those things.
Right.
In which case you don't have your own custom connection implementation. You have like a just simple default implementation that we give you. And so what's the behavior there? And do we need an API? Do we need overloads on from stream and from pipeline to allow you to customize the connection ID in that case? And if not, I mean, I think if we have globally unique, or at least process-wide unique default behavior here, then it's easy to auto-generate one for those. But I think the question becomes, do we want to allow you to customize it in that case?
Right.
I think we just add a nullable optional parameter to the existing method, and if it's null, we generate one for them.
So one,
I think I like
yeah,
that.
that's simple.
So right now it has what, the three properties or the three parameters? It would be the stream / pipe, the properties. I assume is an optional parameter.
The properties and the endpoints.
Right.
So we just add one more connection ID.
So here's a question. So Jeff, that's a really good observation, because I think the one thing that is broken today with how we actually are thinking about this whole thing is if the transport has an ID and then you wrap it in some other stream and you call from stream, how do you preserve the actual transport ID as you're flowing state up the channel, the pipeline? I think we actually potentially need to make it so you don't lose the ID without having to pass in the one from the previous connection explicitly.
I mean,
so are you thinking like
there's no way for us to pull it out of the stream, so they have to pass it in, right? How else are you going to accomplish that?
Or it's a thing in the property bag.
Yeah, exactly. So it could be a feature or a property. What do we call this? Property interface.
Connection properties.
Yeah, it could be one of those that gets consumed by default whenever you don't specify one to the factory.
So given that connections aren't mutable, what you really want is the ability to pass like the old connection and then just the properties that you change. So if you just change the stream, it'd be nice to be able to pass the old connection and then the new stream and then
had that same thought.
New connection.
Connection from connection, right? Where you basically pass in the base connection and you mutate a couple of properties by passing in the stream or other things.
It'd be useful for like adding properties as well. Like if there is like passing the old connection plus these new properties. And then even if we add things to connection, like in .NET 6, like this thing could still copy the right things is the nice thing, instead of having to like have each thing as its own parameter.
Yeah.
So if we're depending on property bags for this, then do we need a connection ID property? Can we just use the property bag to pull out the string?
So
I don't think you should.
You could use a property bag, but it's super nice to have a property as a virtual for things that are super common. So I
it is, but I'm thinking of like if we're mixing and matching the two things, it's kind of weird. Like it would be nice to be consistent. Like either it's in the property bag or it's the concrete property.
Yeah, can't you say the same thing about endpoints? Some things are just like important enough that they're top level properties.
Yeah, we have the same problem with HTTP context in ASP.NET. We struggle to figure out which things should be hosted top level versus which things should be left as properties in the property bag. And we basically do it based on what we think is commonly used. So for example, like in Stefan's PR, he made the ID an extension method because it's used all over the code base. And as a convenience to avoid having to do try get blah over and over, where the property bags are useful when you have things that are optional. I think we want to make this like a required feature, or rather a default feature that's always there that you can rely on. And for those kinds of things, the property bag feels cumbersome to use, right? It's kind of like how local endpoint and remote endpoint are on the base, because they're so commonly used and logged and referenced that you want to hoist it top level. But then for things that are lesser used, like TLS options, you want to keep those in the property bag. And then we happen to be using the property bag as a way to copy and chain properties without having to write a bunch of code. So I think having it be in both isn't wrong per se, nor is it inconsistent. It just happens to be a convenient way to flow state without having to read and write over and over and over as you adapt, right?
That said, if it exists if it can exist in one and it can't exist in the other, then we're going to get into weird situations where, you know, it only exists in one but not in the other, but we really want it to exist in both. I mean, at the very least, it seems like we should make a statement about, like, either it's its own thing and it doesn't live in the property bag at all, or it lives in the property bag, but we can maybe come up with it, like we can add an extension method or something like that that simply pulls it out of the property bag.
So I don't think we should use property bag for this because it should be a required property on the base. It should be that fundamental to all connections. Now, if we're talking about convenience for flowing it as you wrap, there are two options, right? Either what Stefan was saying would be a nice API to add, like connection, not from connection. That basically lets you pass in the base connection. So you pass in the base connection as the factory of things to base off of, and then you can change some properties on it. Or if we don't think that we should add that, we can just have it taking a string. The only issue with having it passing the string explicitly is that you're now going to allocate the string eagerly when you have to wrap, right? So the benefit of having from connection is that you can preserve it from being lazy, even as you adapt. So the first person to actually read the ID will create it.
I don't think the string allocation is super
I'm not
concerning,
saying it's not the end of the world, right? I'm just saying like options.
Yeah, I don't think I would do it as from connection because there's the ambiguity of is it better for you to do the pipe wrapping or the stream wrapping? So I would overload from stream and from pipe to just take a connection as, then, so you've picked which mode you want to be using and then anything that gets added later has I can defer to this other object. So
I love that.
So what does it look like then? So from stream, from pipe, get a new parameter connection ID?
We would both overload them on the first parameter to take a connection base, and then the existing methods, I think for this, they suggested adding the nullable string of connection ID.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm not following. So like you are saying...
Are we proposing to do this in 5, or are we saying that we could add this in the future?
5. And we don't have to add all of them. Emo, can you draw what you're doing on the screen? The APIs?
I can. Let me just copy paste what I currently have. So I just copied basically what the definitions were. So I'm not entirely sure what the modification to that is now.
I can't see this. Wait, did you put it somewhere? Is it on YouTube? Do I have to go on YouTube?
Is it again frozen? I hate Teams.
Are you on one machine?
No, I'm on the same machine.
It's a new machine.
No, I ordered the new machine. I don't have it yet. I don't have it yet.
So are we saying that it will not exist in the property bag anymore, or will it?
We're saying it will not. And we're saying that the alternative to that is these two overloads. And we're trying to figure out which ones to add in 5 and which ones we punt to the future. So I think the easy mode is to have the one that takes a string, and then we can discuss the one that takes a connection itself. And then we can decide, do we need to do all for 5, or can we just do the one that takes a string? I think.
Yeah, the one that takes a connection is interesting to me. I feel like we need some prototyping around that one.
Yeah, and I'm fine punting it for now. I mean, like, Stefan basically has to do that in his code in Castrol, as far as I'm aware of. It's very common, actually. I hit the same thing. But I'm fine punting it until 5 because you can easily work around it.
Yeah, I mean, it does. I wrote some stuff in chat. I don't know how well it'll work. Having the one that takes the connection to wrap means that callers who use that one are already set up for success as this evolves in the future. But if there's some other property and they have the why can't I forward the blah-de-blah property? What code change do I have to do? Oh, instead of calling from stream connection.get stream, etc., I just change it to connection based.from stream the connection, and great, everything's just magic now. So that can be done later.
Yep.
especially if it's complicated. But I think from an API conceptual perspective, adding the overload there is reasonable. Is there a chance it can introduce ambiguity? Sorry, this is the overloading for the first time makes things weird, right? I'm having trouble thinking of a way it breaks because it's static, so it should be fine.
And the first argument is different. It's good because that's required.
Yeah, well, it's overloading something that previously didn't have overloads. Adding an overload in another version has more complications than other overloads, but these types shouldn't be implicitly convertible to each other, so there's no ambiguity. I mean, and then like somebody could have their own connection type that they write a implicit conversion to stream on, which we can't stop them, but that as long as we don't provide it in box, it's not likely. And so I think it can be added later without problem. Like it'll be a problem for reflection because everything's a problem for reflection, but
yeah,
as a static, it won't even have to risk a challenge with extension methods that would be likely to have been written. So
right.
I think it's fine to punt the overloads out, and that we won't say why we can't add them in the next version. I can't think of a reason yet why we would say no next version. How's that for a definitive statement?
I like it.
Are we changing the existing from pipe from stream method?
Sure.
Sorry.
I think tacking on a nullable string connection ID at the end.
All right. Perfect.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. We're gonna force the string allocation, which is fine. I'll survive. Does that seem reasonable?
Yeah.
And frankly,
that's
if
good.
the string isn't already allocated at that point, you probably don't care.
Yeah, exactly.
But yeah, anyway.
I think at least within ASP and within HTTP client, we would end up using this. So the expectation is the allocation is going to happen at least for the two major use cases.
Well,
users
but
can
tracing,
deal with it.
If you don't have tracing on, then you can make the argument connection IDs never get materialized today.
That's true. Yeah.
I don't think it matters. I don't think one string is going to kill us. There's certainly plenty of other overhead to a connection, but
Yep.
And if it does, you could implement connection yourself without using the helpers. Be pretty advanced, I assume. If that one string allocation per connection is really biting you.
I'm sorry for the rat hole.
so I hate to reopen anything here, but if this is if the connection IDs are generated on demand, then you can potentially get into, like, on first use, then you're going to get into a weird scenario where, like, you turn tracing on and then all of a sudden everything gets random connection IDs that don't have anything to do with the order they were actually created in. Maybe that's fine, but it just seems weird.
Well, I think we said that the default implementation would be GUID, new GUID. And the ones that we overload would probably be based on some sort of existing counter that we have. So there would be like a long field already with it. It's just the string allocation that would be late bound, but probably not the ID generation.
If it's new GUID, then you're right. There's no issue. But I thought we said it was monotonically increasing integers. Did I miss that?
Did we? Okay. I thought we went back and forth.
We went back and forth. Yeah.
We punted that decision out of the meeting.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think we said
I feel that with all the real connections that are going to be provided, that they're all going to have semantic IDs. I mean, I could be wrong, but it seems like if socket uses something like the source port, destination IP in its the way it builds an ID, then it wouldn't matter if tracing was turned on late, things built based off that notion are going to have still implemented it. Plus, the moment you wrap something, that would have called the generator, and that would have gotten its ID. It would only be things that weren't wrapped that would maybe get an out of order ID for them, like at the moment that tracing was turned on.
It's interesting to say that we think that most providers will have semantic connection IDs because we don't do that today, right? I mean, the way you're logging in ASP.NET works is just incrementing integers, right?
Yep.
So while it's interesting to explore that, to say that we think all of them are going to have that seems a little weird since they don't today.
No, they kind of do, right? This isn't an issue in ASP.NET because we actually generate the ID and use it super early. We don't wait until tracing is turned on, because that would have the weird effect that you said, right?
Yeah. No, I'm just commenting specifically on what the connection IDs for sockets are going to be.
Right.
I mean, I'm just observing that today they are literally 1, 2, 3 converted.
Yes, they are. Yep.
So it could be that we change that to something that's semantically meaningful in the future, like IP port pairs. But that seems it's not obvious to me that we do that.
There's a nuanced distinction with the IP port pair too, which is that even though they should be unique at any given time, like they could be reused in the future.
Yes, they absolutely can be reused.
Right. But so, I mean, in incrementing integer, you hit up enter, and now you're starting back at 0. So.
Yeah, but I mean, the question is how quickly are they reused, right? Like FIDs are reused all the time. Socket pairs, there's at least a minimum of like 2 minutes before you can reuse it, right? Well, maybe
long you're not going to reuse till the heat death of the universe.
Like,
it's true. Like longs, like have you ever? It takes forever.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, long is fine.
I mean, but that'll restart, assuming that it's zero initted memory. It restarts when the process starts, and it's shared. If you look at the logs of two processes interweaved, then their IDs are interweaved. Versus a source port, destination port combination at any relative time range is unique.
Yeah.
So they're all trade-offs. That's the implementation detail.
So I've used Jeremy's snippet from the chat. Is that what everybody agrees with?
Remove the ones that take connection bits. That's for later date, I think. Those are for 6.0.
And make connection ID nullable.
Right.
Or
it is
defaulted to null. Sorry.
Yes.
Right.
Oh yes, because I think it would have to be. What I wrote's a compile error. That's what I get for writing it in Teams. For some reason, it doesn't have red squiggles. Please don't add that feature.
Too late. We're already filling out a user voice for it.
A user voice, Jesus.
That's how they take feedback, man.
Nobody takes
You're not
feedback,
supposed to
man.
use connect.microsoft.com.
All right, in the snippet, where's the actual connection ID property?
It's at the very end of the method.
Yeah, no, but I mean, we're also adding we discussed adding a property with a.
Oh, it's not in the snippet.
Yeah.
It was on connection base, right? Not connection.
Yeah. Fair enough. Yeah. Right. Right. So connection is what has from pipe and from stream. Connection base is what gets the ID, and so we still and we want the connection ID property to be non-virtual, so that it can guarantee one-shottedness of calling a protected member.
Yeah. So what I have public string connection ID, and I have protected virtual create connection ID. Virtual string, of course.
Yeah.
All right. Are we done then?
Yes, we did. Yep. 1 of 5 in 40 minutes.
Woo!
It was a one-liner.
Yeah. One of mine should be really fast though. So.
I see we
Should have
found
seen
the
the 3-hour long conversation we had about it yesterday.
careful of things that take 3 hours. A 3-hour tour.
There are no simple APIs. That's basically the bottom line.
Oh, right. Emo's thing's not refreshing. Can you shout out an issue number?
Well, sorry, I'm still posting. I've not done anything. So, API approved. All right.
I guess the normal thing I do here is I open YouTube and then I share my screen.
Yes, that works. So I'm right now looking at 40862, which is Jan's issue. Sorry, Jan.
Wait, is the screen changing?
No.
Okay.
I can't. So I literally can't. I already stopped sharing my screen. That's how bad Teams is.
Ah.
Jamie,
do you want to do the other connection one?
This is interesting.
Smart
All right.
5.0.
This is trippy.
Yeah, so this one was reviewed last week, and there was some follow-up discussion about the approved shape of the API. I think there are two issues raised. One issue is that the process path, it has really nothing to do with the app or application, so it kind of doesn't make sense for the app prefix to be in the name. And I think the second issue is that the other API that doesn't return process path, that's basically equivalent to app context get base path. That it's unclear what it should return, like it's kind of poorly specified. And there's basically a lot of kind of policy questions about what it should return in different situations.
Yeah, so last time, so we talked about basically there's like 3 different concepts, right? And I think we convinced ourselves that only 2 of them actually make sense, which is the path to the actual process itself, and then the path to the wherever other modules, or basically wherever the application came from, right? So that you can load other assets. And then I think there was more follow-up to that. So I guess my question is, what do people think about the last comment that I made? Is that the right direction, or is that not the right direction?
Have you scrolled there? Because YouTube doesn't know that yet.
I'm scrolling back and forth on a different screen to figure out what I should scroll to. So basically what I commented was this, and then I suppose the current proposal, I guess, at the very top is what you think is the right one, right, Jan? Which would basically be process path and advanced directory.
My take on this would be to just add the environment.process path and don't add environment.app-based directory. There is app context-based directory, and there is same property on app domain, and WinForms has the same property. All of them are returning the same path. So I'm not sure whether we are doing any good by adding fourth API that returns the exact same value, right? So.
Do we have an API that returns the entry point to the application?
Well, we have API that returns entry point assembly, right?
Sure. So I guess in this case, the entry point assembly would be the assembly that contained the main method that .NET.exe called into, right?
Yeah, that's the entry point assembly, right? Okay. But there are a number of cases where there is no entry point assembly, like when the CLR is hosted, or there are cases where the entry point assembly doesn't have path, right? When it's kind of embedded or loaded from memory or so.
Yeah.
So my issue with that position, that we already have app context base directory, is that it is documented as not being this. And in 3.0, we already shipped a feature, published single file, that that broke this, in my opinion, right? Like app context base directory is defined as this is where the loader is going to look for DLLs by default. And that's not what we're saying this property should be. We're saying this property should be where the user thinks his or her application came from.
That's fair, but like then the question is, what are you doing with that directory? Because if you're using it to effectively load other DLLs, then that's the wrong location, right?
Is it?
Of course it is, but that's not the only thing you can do with it, right? Like if you look at the use example I wrote in there, or even like look at the Golang OS executable, it's not just DLLs, right? It's any other resource. So I want to make a log file right next to my exe. How do I do that today?
So don't get me wrong. I'm not saying I disagree with you. All I'm saying is we have different scenarios, and the question is if because of what you just described, of we innovated the platform, we changed things. Maybe that's part of the problem, right? Because when we say base directory, we say, well, here's the path to the application, and then we say, well, here's also where the loader looks for DLLs. Then the naming doesn't really help you with determining which one you should use, right? And that's kind of why I originally said, let's have different properties on the same type, so we basically promote these as individual concepts and tell people like, okay, here's different things you can look at, and depending on what your scenarios, you have to choose among them to get the correct response, right? And so like if we say there's a location where you probe for DLLs and there's a location where you should probe for, your database file, for example, or your other, image files that you ship with your application, then that's a different directory, right? And so that's my concern when we say, well, some things are in app context and we just call it base directory, and then there's another, app, whatever it's called here, app-based directory on environment that returns a different thing. Then we're not really helping the customer to make a determination, right? We're basically just muddying the waters with sprinkling APIs over various areas. So I think to me the duplication only makes sense when we centralize the different ways you can resolve paths, and then the naming makes it clear which one you should use for which scenario. But
I think it's incredibly hard to come up with APIs that match the scenarios. It's like I think I kind of like the place we are today, where we have like base directory. It's like something that works for like 90% of the cases, and if the policy that it implements doesn't work for the given case, just let people to assemble it from the kind of policy-free APIs. Like they can combine the entry point assembly, the exe path, whatever else they want.
But we have to, in order to do that, we have to like give them other APIs to know what kind of environment they're running in, right? Like I can't do. There's no way for me, even if we have process path, right? Like say we have process path, I can't use process path all the time to say this is where my app is, because my app might have been invoked from programfiles.net.exe path to my app, and now process path is programfiles.net.exe. That's not where I'm going to be looking for image files, right? So I can't use that one. I can't use app context base directory, because in single file we open a new temp directory and put a bunch of DLLs there and say, well, that's the base directory. It's like, well, I don't want my users to have to go find a log file in some temp directory, right? So it's like,
we can have APIs that return you the other kind of policy-free environment properties, right? It's I think that would sound reasonable to me. I just question the implementing more APIs that implement some arbitrary policy, that's different from the one we have.
Yeah, I guess I'm not shooting for more policy, right? I guess I'm more with Eric on the side of like, okay, if I don't know how the app is being built yet, whether it's AOT or whether it's just run with .NET or whether it's actually run with a shim, what API do you want me to use to find image files? And today we don't have that API, right?
But what do you mean by finding image files?
So like if I ship my exe, right, let's say I ship my program, right, now I want to load, let's say it's a database file or a PNG file that I deployed with my application. What would I do?
I think my recommendation would be ship the app as exe and use the get process path to handle this case. Like the .NET, running the things with .NET, it doesn't work today already in a number of cases. For example, you cannot really run WinForms app using .NET foo.dll. And there are like other cases where it doesn't work, right? So it's like when you are building concrete app, I think it's very reasonable to say, hey, this app has to be run this way, and if you run it the other way, just don't do it.
So let me just try to get your position. Then, is it then fair that you don't believe in having an API that works regardless on how the app was executed? You're basically saying in the context of a particular app that is either AOT or not AOT, it's either statically linked or it's not, either it's run with .NET or it's not. For this particular app, the developer is on the hook to find the appropriate API to find their files, but there's not the single API that will work for all the scenarios.
Yeah.
So there's no story for library developers?
I mean, honestly, for library developers, I kind of agree with Jan, because it is virtually impossible to write a library and make assumptions about how, what the application, how the application is being deployed. That virtually never works. I think if you are the app developer and you want to load resources, you're in control of where they are, right? Like the library cannot assume that, oh yeah, the file that I'm depending on is always relative to the exe, right? That's not going to fly.
Yeah, I'm just making sure that we're aware that we're making the statement that there's not that a library developer has to figure this out themselves with give me a base path or implement this callback in your host or whatever.
Why wouldn't the library developer look relative to their own library itself?
No, you wouldn't, right?
Single file AOT.
Yeah, that's a good example where it stops working, right?
Right. There's no way to get yourself's location in single file because location's null.
So.
Oh, okay. I thought that it actually expanded out to the right folder. Okay.
So hold on. Want this break configuration in ASP.NET?
Why would it
break? Are you an
it?
app or are you a library?
Or do we have to change
ASP.NET
somehow?
does current directory in a lot of places.
It does. So we have one piece of code in the host that does current directory, and then everything in ASP.NET will use that resolve path that's configured in the host upfront. So it's actually in one place in the entire application.
The reason I just dealt with a bug in 3x because when they publish single file and they use hosting, but they don't use the default hosting that like ASP.NET uses that sets from current directory, but they're using hosting and they're like, things don't work anymore. Hosting's broke. It's like, well, it's because hosting's using app context base directory. And that's set to some random temp directory, right? It's like, which completely breaks hosting. And so
this is gonna give you the path to the exe, and is that reliable to use for finding configuration files that get copied to your bin folder?
If your app was run with .NET.exe path to your app, the process path is the path to .NET.exe.
Which is the case of app, right?
How do you find your configuration files?
Right, exactly.
In every case.
Exactly. That's exactly my point.
Right, and imagine you have like some component that's hosting ASP.NET or something that needs configuration, right? And it's like it has nothing to do with like the kind of process paths or anything. It's just like path to random component, that may be somewhere, and you kind of want configuration from there,
So that I understand. Like you can't make it work if you don't own the host per se. But in the case where it's a single application running, I guess it isn't really library or host. You have an app running where there's library that wants to know where the entry point is to find configuration files. And depending on how you deploy that same application, the same application itself, right? So I have one app running either a single file or self-contained or whatever. I should be able to find where is that true? Where the configuration files got placed in the directory. I'm wondering if that's true or not.
Well, so there are two different cases of configuration files. It might be configuration files that you want to get bundled so that they don't actually live as separate files on disk, or you can have like configuration files that you actually want to live on disk as separate things, right?
Right. So by default in ASP.NET Core, we exclude the app settings JSON file from the bundle, and we put it on disk, and then we want to load it from where it is on disk. Would I use base directory for that? Because today I believe we use current directory.
Right.
And that was done for a bad reason, I recall. Why did we do that? Because I think it makes double clicking work, but if you run from a different folder, it doesn't work.
If it's .NET Run, when you .NET Run at the project directory.
Yeah. That
your base directory is going to be your bin debug, but you want to load your content from the project directory.
Right. That's what it was. Right. Content root.
One chance, then that's
okay.
You're failing.
So my opinion here is I think we need a whole new app context variable to define this. I think what we've defined as app context base directory isn't this value. And then the host starts setting it, and if you're in hosted scenario where it's some other host, then they should pass that in if you need it. And 90-some% of the time, yes, it's going to be the same as app context base directory.
I mean, I don't think it's wrong. It just is this, you're chasing the long tail of, policy heavy APIs, right? Where you add more and more values because you have more and more nuance, right? That's the downside to it. But I agree with you that it seems common enough that we should think about it. And like, I also think we make our own lives more miserable if we make going from, regular bin deployed multi-file to bin deployed single file much harder if we don't have a portable API between these two.
I think, like defining the policy, right? Somebody needs to sit down. There's like at the end of the discussion, there are like all the different cases that, how the application can be deployed. So I would suggest that if we want kind of the policy have API or APIs, we track it as separate issue and just focus this one on the policy free process part.
I can live with that.
In your background and motivation, it says the path of the current process is often needed for logging or to find more files next to the current process.
Mm-hmm.
When would somebody want to find more files next to .NET.exe, but then find different files when they're in a published single file? Do you know what I mean? Like, why would somebody need process path?
For example, we want to, for logging, it's useful to know what the exe started the process. And, there are like number of interrupt scenarios where you kind of want to inspect your exe, especially on Windows, like with manifests and, those things.
I mean,
if you just don't, if you know that your app doesn't work, if your app has to be published as exe, then you can just use process exe path as a thing, right?
So it's not for finding more files next to the current process executable.
Well, it is, but I would say that it is for finding paths next to the current process executable in case that the app is published as exe. It's not, hosted, or it's not, published as platform neutral and all that.
See, I think the more important API here is the second API. Is the I want a folder that I can get other files, either creating more or finding other ones next to where I consider my application is.
I mean,
the first one of getting which is the exe that loaded this. Like I think that's less useful.
I mean, to a certain extent, I hear what you're saying, but also I strongly believe the in blue pill or red pill APIs, right? This is a red pill API, right? It tells you accurately which process is running your application, right? And I think it's important that we also have those APIs, right? Because we need to have plumbing and implementation infrastructure that they can actually reliably tell, okay, what is the process, right? And then there is scenario-specific virtualized APIs that are like kind of more giving you the blue pill environment where it's like, well, if you want to load content files, they give you the content file directory, and that might be different radius based on how you're hosted, and that makes more scenarios work, right? But I wouldn't necessarily block red pill APIs just because we haven't designed the blue pill yet. So in that sense, I would agree with that. I mean, my only concern with splitting this design is that, as I said, I don't want to sprinkle these APIs over different types, but I think environment seems like the right location for app process path, or I should say process path in this case. And then if we decide later that we have, I don't know, content path or something, then it seems reasonable to put this on environment as well. Even if it's just read from some app context setting, right? It doesn't really matter for the user.
I think that if I'm a new user to this API and I'm just looking at what's in environment and not reading the well-written documentation, I would assume that this would point to the exe that I ran, not necessarily to a self-extracted temporary folder.
Right. This is what I meant earlier with like, we need to have good docs, right? I mean, you basically have to say like / comments or summaries that show up in IntelliSense needs to differentiate these. And that's also why I think naming is important, that they're tied together so they're not like, far apart in IntelliSense, right? That's why I originally had the app prefix so that they're all tied together. But I think in general, like, I think environment is not that large. Like, I mean, we have like, 15 properties on it or 20 or something like this. So it's, people can find stuff. I'm less concerned about that. I don't think app context is a better place because it's just not a type people are very familiar with. And it has some esoteric plumbing that is not relevant for the vast majority of users. So then
what path does this API, process path, what path does it return when you run in self-extracted publish single file mode?
I would think the thing double-clicked, right?
Right, it's the exe path, like it's kind of non-ambiguous, right? It's like whatever OS tells you, right?
It's not going to be the temp directory that we self-extracted the stuff to.
Right.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, that sounds good to me.
So just for the things that do the temp directory extraction model, that means that the executable that is extracting into a temp directory doesn't launch a child process. It then becomes the host after doing the extraction.
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay.
And
so this is the path to the thing that if you do if you're looking in the task manager or T-list or top, this is the thing that shows up.
Yeah. And it's mentioned at the bottom of the issue, like this model where the exe and the DLL of the entry point are in different directories. It's not unique to this self-extract thing, right? Xamarin on Android has a similar setup where the exe lives in one directory and the entry point DLL lives in a different directory. So that's how the things have to be laid out on disk due to the OS restrictions.
Right. So how about this then? So if we want to split this, I mean, I'm fine with just saying we only approve environment process path for now, and then we revisit the content path as a secondary issue. Are you okay with that, Eric, or do you think we should tie them together?
I'm fine with it if we feel that we have need for this API. I just think the other API is more important. But if we have need for this API, I agreed not to block it because we can't agree on what the other one should be.
Yeah, I mean, this is also early for 6, right? So in that sense, it doesn't really matter. Like, even if you change our mind later, we can rename the other API if it really comes down to that.
Yeah, I mean, no matter what we do for the other one, I think we have the right API for process path. Nullable string, named process path. I think that makes sense. So I'm fine with that plan. Is basically what I was meaning to say.
And presumably it's a static API, right? All right, so then Eric, do you want to file the issue for the other one then?
Yep, I can do that.
Just file one empty one right now so I can just link to it. That would be great from the notes.
Okay.
Just hit new issue, save.
We file.
See what area the bot assigns it to.
Void.
You ready for a number, or you want me to text it?
Yeah, ready for the number.
41341.
So I say it one more time.
41341.
Perfect.
This is a very well written API issue.
Thanks.
Does it have at least 3 interrobangs?
I don't know what those are.
The question mark, exclamation mark.
Oh.
Not for nullability, but for being aghast at why this API doesn't already exist.
All right, so then I think we can call this a day. Yep. All right. Gee. All right, so then next issue we're looking at is background service task. I think. Who filed this? I think Eric filed for this, right? Oh, Eric.
Yeah, the community filed for it, but and then we changed it a little bit. Fowler also knows a lot about this as well. So in hosting, we have an abstract class called background service, and background service has 2 methods on it. It has like a start async and a stop async, and start async returns a task for the starting of the background service. So if you go into asynchronous mode, the task that comes back from start async is complete because I started and my service is now running. So there's no way for somebody outside of the class to understand is the service done or not, because you can't get access to the actual task that's executing the service. And so there's other reasons as well that it's important for hosting right now. If the background service starts doing something asynchronously and returns that completed task during start, and then an exception happens, nobody's logging that exception. And so the way we need to be able to do that is by getting the executing task and being able to log when it fails, basically. And so the idea here is to expose the executing task, the task that's running the background service for these kinds of scenarios.
So who would await that, or who would log the exception?
So technically, the host, we have another class called the host, which is the one that started up all the services in the container. The host would do a continue with on the executing task. And when that thing's done, check if it's faulted. And if it's faulted, then write the exception to the log.
Who calls execute async if not the host?
So today, the way background services, background service implements an interface called iHosted service, and both of those two things have start async and stop async. And so background service itself is the one that so the host calls start async on the background service. Background services start async calls its protected execute method. I don't know.
Thanks. Yeah, no, I'm looking at it now. That explains it.
So that's why the host doesn't have access to like the executing task or the thing that's actually executing. It's just able to start the service, and then it gets back the completed task that it started, and now it has no ability to monitor it at all.
Right, except for by calling stop async, it looks like. But because the executing task is awaited there, it looks like.
Yeah, when you want to stop, it says it like cancels the token and then waits for the executing task to finish.
Right. So this is for like observing early exit kind of scenarios.
Yeah, I mean the bug that was logged was, I mean, pretty simple. Implement a background service that await.yields right away and then throws an exception a second later, and your process looks like it's hung because nothing got logged and nothing's happening.
Right. So the whole just some background. The way this works is that the start-stop model was more of an explicit on-off kind of pattern. And then we offered an alternate model built on top of the start-stop model that was for long-running tasks. So you can imagine the start-stop model is good for doing like for making a timer and firing things until stop is called, versus where you want to run code on a background queue to dequeue something in a long-running loop. So they're kind of two different patterns for the same long-running task model. And in the second pattern is a detail of the iHosted service, so we don't expose the task object from the background service, which means no one can observe anything about that execution besides the implementation itself.
So is the host gonna ascast to like background service or whatever and look for this, or does it already have a special concept of background services versus other iHosted services?
So what? I missed that.
So if the host is going to be using this executing task, does it already know which of its iHosted services are background services, or is it going to have to like?
It would downcast.
Yeah. Okay. So the question is like, is this something that's like relevant enough that it should be on iHosted service?
On the interface? Ah!
I guess the default would be weird, and we're not using default interface methods yet or anything like that.
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Did I mention that interfaces have problems?
Right? These things are
it would be a lie.
Oh, we can't. Yeah,
Oh,
can't.
that too.
Net standard 2.0, like we.
Yeah.
Well, let's ignore
That's
the
spitballing.
let's ignore the breaking change perspective here, but like the question I think is still valid. Like if you just have an iHosted service that I implement directly, where I just implement start and stop, how would anybody monitor me?
Exactly. So that's a good question. You may not even have a task, right? In that case. So for example, in the case of a timer, you don't have a task. The timer event runs arbitrarily on some background thread on occasion, and when stop calls, you stop it. And in those cases, you log your own like errors.
So basically, in other words, if you implement iHosted service, you own the actual execution, and you're on the hook for logging any errors or making them observable, right? And if you don't, then that's a failure of the implementation of iHosted service. Versus if you derive background service, the only job you have is override execute async, and that should be sufficient.
Right, and there are alternate, I guess, suggestions for this model is where you don't actually expose a task, but you expose some method that basically lets you signal failure or completion in some form, which basically is a task. To let the host basically do stuff for you on your behalf. So if we wanted this behavior on iHosted service, you can imagine having a different interface that exposed the task that you could implement optionally that the host could check for instead of being on the actual background.
But if iHosted service start async returns a task, and that's the same task that would be exposed here, why isn't it just up to the person who called it to put the task somewhere useful?
It's not the same task necessarily, because when the background service starts going, like await yield, the starting task gets completed. Like, okay, the service is now up and running. So the thing that came back from start async is now a completed task.
Okay, so start async returns a task that starts a service, which is different than the service doing work.
Right.
And then the description for background service is it's the property that it's exposing is the work that background service is doing.
Yep.
It's literally the result of execute async, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yep.
So what is this cancellation token that is passed in? Where does that come from?
The host, the caller.
And how does the host cancel that? What's the signaling mechanism for that?
So the model is whenever the host is going to shut down, it'll cancel the running operation by canceling the token passed into execute async. And then your job is to yield within that time frame.
Does that mean that the task will transition to canceled rather than completed?
The one returned to the host, the way it works is in stop async of the background service, it does a task with any, waiting for the timeout to fire, the token that was passed in to stop to fire. So you stop passing in a token, and that token represents how long stop will wait until the actual task. It's kind of a grace period. Right?
Yeah. So stop itself can fail. That makes sense. What I'm asking about is execute async itself. What does the cancellation token in there do?
That thing signals to the long-running loop that is your code to shut down.
And you expect that when the cancellation token fires, the return task transitions to successfully completed rather than canceled.
Correct.
That's
Unless
weird.
it was ungraceful. Unless it was ungraceful.
I don't understand why it would, how would you enforce it? Because if I just do, let's say, execute async, I just have a while loop with task delay, and then in my blue body I just say stopping token throw if canceled.
It's not enforced. It's either going to be canceled or successful. Is what we expect.
Or faulted.
So you
it could be either.
You interpret canceled as success.
Yes, we do. Not failure.
Okay.
I see.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, it's docked as the stopping token, not the cancellation. I mean, it's a cancellation token, but its name in execute async is stopping token, and it's docked as triggered when stop async is called.
Right.
Does that mean that this task property that's being introduced would have the same behavior? Anybody who looks at it and sees canceled should interpret it as success?
That's a good question.
I would say yes.
Yeah.
It is interesting that stop async can exit before execute async does if you cancel the token.
Well, I mean, it either has to do that or it hangs forever.
I mean, this is my other question. So what is the lifetime of a background service? Is it always the same as the process? Or can you have background services that start, stop, and end?
Today, you can't restart after stopping. So you start once and stop once. At least that's the implementation that the host has.
And dispose is only called when the actual thing is shut down entirely, right?
Correct.
So that means the background service basically sticks around forever then, and then, but then basically everybody who would observe that thing is basically executing during shutdown as well, right?
Right.
So in that case, does it matter whether it's canceled or succeeded?
No. The only difference is we don't want to report cancel the error on shutdown if you were trying to cancel an operation but not legally cancel it.
You don't want to crash on shutdown because
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But we could argue and say if you want to avoid that, catch yourself. That's That's not our problem.
Right.
But today we interpret that. I believe we try to swallow the exception. I think.
Yeah, I guess if the only thing that needs to happen is logging when the thing throws an exception, then I think that makes sense. It still seems a bit weird that we expose the raw task because it kind of seems to say we're leaking implementation, but
yeah.
I mean, again, because you can't really await it. I mean, you could, but then you literally run during shutdown at that point, which doesn't seem very useful.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, if you get really fancy, like if you get a canceled task prior to stop async being called, like that's probably something you'd want to be logged.
Yeah. So one question I have is, if we didn't expose a task and want to expose a contract, would it end up looking like task? Like what things do you need to communicate from the iHosted service to the host? Like, am I done yet? Did I fail? How did I fail?
So this issue was originally logged last year, back in June.
Yep.
Their description, Graham Horner's description was, as a developer, I'm unable to determine if a registered background service is running and/or has ran to completion or faulted.
And this is a problem for hosted services in general.
In general, yeah, it is.
But we can't fix it because of the interface.
Well, you can, right?
So we could add a new interface, right?
Right. So you can, yeah, exactly. So we can add a new interface that basically has the task, and if you do implement it, you can report your status via the task.
Right, because if you want to know if the thing's running, if background service has, like, I assume it's something like a task scheduler, and so if it has no work to do, wouldn't it potentially report null as its current task? But it's still running.
Yeah.
There's a single execute async method, right? That gets called by start async that is abstract and you have to override. So if that stops running, the assumption is
you're done.
Like, first of all, that task can't be null, right? I guess it could be, but
because I guess the question is that, because if that task is the background service, then I think the name is weird. If it's something the background service is doing, like that it's represents a piece of in-queued work or something, where it's again effectively a task scheduler, then the name makes sense. But if it's
it represents the entire background service operation, like working. So imagine you want to build a dashboard that did a loop over all these services in the process and showed a status for them. How would you implement that? I think exposing the task is a clean way to do it, because you would just loop over all of them and check the status, and then if it was not running, you would print the actual.
Sure, I'm just
status.
Like looking at the API description.
Yeah.
And even the summary statement with it. This to me sounds like a piece of work that it is doing, and not the piece of work that represents its entirety.
I see.
So public task,
if you read
task
this
would be I have started executing whatever it is that I'm doing, whether or not that, like, I can be idle, but I'm still doing idle.
So I'm going to read the current dot comment for background service dot execute async. It's, this method is called when the hosted service starts. The implementation should return a task that represents the lifetime of the long-running operations being performed. So someone could choose not to do that today, and there would be no problems because it's not really observed. Like, if you just decided to, like, use the timer to do your background stuff and have execute async exit early, things would work today, but you're going against the dot comments.
I mean, logically, like, what this task is, right? Like, it start async just calls execute async, takes the resulting task, and stashes it in a property, and that's what this thing returns, right? So, like, it is possible that this thing returns null if nobody has called start async yet. But as soon as somebody has called start async, that's the value that it will have, even after calling stop async, because then you just have a completed task.
Yep. Yeah. So
if they call start again, then it replaces it again.
Well, there's no restart, right? I think was the point.
There isn't, but I like that. So it's null if no one calls start. Makes sense.
Yeah.
But yeah, I would just call that task, like public task, and it is the task that was created from start. Like, or,
returned by execute async, which is implemented by the user. I actually like putting execute in the name of the task because it's returned by execute async, which is defined by the person who
I mean, you
created
could
the
literally
background
just
service.
call it execute task rather than executing task, right? Because I agree with Jeremy, executing task seems like it's a transient thing that may change over time, which this thing doesn't, right? It's either null or it is the thing, right? Like there's only really one.
TPL data flow has a completion property that returns a task. We might consider that.
It's completion.
I like execute tasks too. I do like having execute in the name because that makes it more clear. Like this is the task returned by execute async.
So that's fine. It's the ing is the thing that's
I agree with that.
making me feel like it is describing transient data.
Yeah.
I feel like we should consider the interface though.
Mm-hmm.
What would you name the
So
interface?
like a new interface that hosted services would implement in addition to iHosted service.
iHosted service too, obviously.
No.
Oh,
So no. Sorry.
let's go.
I think this would have to be an optional interface.
Right.
Yeah, totally.
So what
Could
would
be
the interface achieve
another-
though? That the abstract base type doesn't achieve.
You could implement the interface on your hosted service directly, and the host would still have the same features. So the host could like cast to your IE, IE can track your lifetime.
Right, because the host today does not treat background services differently than any other iHosted service. This would be the first time it would
That's
do
correct.
so, right?
Yeah.
So that would be why. It's like just so any iHosted
Sure,
service
but
would
like
do it.
I would generally say, like to me, whether you downcast to an interface or you downcast to an abstract base type is virtually identical. Like I mean,
Well,
if,
No, but
service might
but
already
we
be
have the
deriving
interface
from
already.
something else.
Yeah. The interface is the actual core primitive, and the base class was supposed to be convenient. So
yes, I understand. All I'm saying is that this is an example where this doesn't hold up, right? So like we can either add more primitives over time, or we just say fuck it, we just make the one the primitive now.
oh, you mean basically add the features to the background service and then leave those services as less feature rich.
Deprecate iHosted service.
No, but yes.
I mean,
No,
in
but
a
yes.
sense, yes. I mean, like because otherwise you have just a moving target, right? Because then literally you would have to say I host service too, because that's the best you can do. Because then at least you communicate which one people should extend. I
don't think this. I think that yes, that's true. And if we were gonna basically evolve this thing over time and it would gain a ton of features, I just don't think it will get that many features. And you can put my name on that statement.
It's on YouTube, right?
I mean,
Yeah, on
back
YouTube.
service start async and stop async are already virtual.
Yep.
So I mean, you could just say that was the hosted service contract, if you will, right? Like the interface really isn't buying much, other than burning your base class,
Yep.
right? I mean, that's really all you're getting here.
Yes.
And something for DI to, you put, instead of putting background service as the service type, you're putting iHosted service.
I mean, I'm just curious, like, what does an iHosted service task look like that would not effectively replicate what background service does? Because even in my own one that I implemented, I basically just have start that kicks off work, and I think in my case I don't even complete start at all. I just run forever in start. I think I'm a bad boy. So like, I think
the only thing I can think of that is the timer case. You can imagine implementing the timer yourself. So in start, new timer, you pass in a callback. In stop async, you call stop on the timer, and the task represents the timer execution. That isn't necessarily a task, but you could implement the interface to make it work that way.
Right,
you
you could have like a TCS.
Could derive from background service and do the same thing, right? You could override start and you could override stop and do the exact same thing.
Yeah, you could.
You could even have execute async effectively no op and return your TCS.task or whatever. But yeah, it's like how much of a pain is it to derive from a base class as opposed to implement an interface? And for most people, it's probably not much of a difference.
Yeah, I wouldn't do that until if we only put it on background service. It just means that we would downcast the background service in the host and just handle it differently there. That's not
right.
It's either downcast to background service or downcast to some other interface, right?
Yeah.
Right.
one feels better than the other.
Yeah, that's the thing I don't
Well,
understand.
yeah.
But I won't say which because I don't have any actual. I don't have any opinion. But I do. But I don't.
Yeah. Well, it feels like, given everything we just said, if we were to design this now, we wouldn't have iHosted service. We would just have background service.
If it were designed in this room, 100% I agree.
Yep. And it seems like we're basically moving in that direction, and we're going to be resolving iHosted services from DI for backcompat.
Yeah, it's true. Okay,
you can still just implement the interface. You just wouldn't get this new capability or potentially more capabilities in the future.
Yep. I'm good with it. So
did we decide on a name? Execute task?
That's my vote.
I mean, that feels a little weird. Execution task is better than executing task. But execute task at least is parallel to the name. So I care about the ing. Once the ing is gone, I have a lot fewer opinions.
And the reasoning is because the ing means the task could change over time.
So being not super familiar with the type, in fact, being completely unfamiliar with the type, the word executing task to me sounds like it's individual pieces of work, and it lets you find out things like, hey, am I currently being run by this background? So it represents a task it's currently working on, which will complete, and then it will do something else. But execute task being this is the task that was returned by execute async is like, oh, okay, it's this one task. That's the glory of somebody who doesn't know what the API is supposed to do. They get to tell you what new people will think that the method or property actually does. So.
Is execution task bad? I mean, when you said that one, I was like, yeah, that one sounds more like English.
I think remember the task. The task is returned by execute async. It is the task returned by execute async. So having it as similar to that as possible, I like.
Right.
Execute task is probably fine.
Yeah, shun is just changing it for part of speech, I think. So.
Yeah, I mean, I can live with either one. Like, to me, I'm more with Jeremy. Like, I don't like the ing, but like execution or execute would both work for me.
Okay, so no one cares about the name, so I can care. Execute task. Perfect.
Okay.
Sounds good to me. And presumably it's a property, not a field, right? We agree with that too.
Oh yeah.
Definitely a field.
I should have put Git.
Should be a public field so we can like exchange it. I'm kidding.
That seems reasonable.
Sorry, that was my mistake. It's not even settable protected, right? Like, it'll only ever be set in start.
Correct.
By the result of execution.
So it should be protected, right? Protected set.
No. It's a public. Git only. Yep, exactly what you have there.
So how would you, like, if you override start then yourself, how would you set it?
You have to call start if you want the execute task. We'll have to deal with it being null and host.
No, I mean, like, if you extend background service, right? Like task, like start, stop, and execute are all virtual, right? So if I have my own stuff happening, then how would I ever set execute task?
You wouldn't unless we decide to make it protected. If we decide that's important.
Make it virtual. Make it virtual.
Yeah.
I guess that works.
Hold on. Or set virtual better instead of.
I like virtual more than settable.
Virtual.
I mean, either one works for me, but making it read only seems a recipe for disaster because then you can't. Then you would have to do some crazy gymnastics with calling base. That seems worse.
Wait, not making it settable means you have to do what?
So if it's not virtual and it's not settable, then in order for me to get the right behavior, I would have to do something crazy like call base.start async and then hope that, well, now it calls execute async, and now I have to do something like, return the correct thing from that, and that seems more gymnasticy than it probably should be.
Agreed. I like it being virtual as a solution to that.
All right, so then that one is done as well.
Did you mark that approved?
Did I not? Apparently not. No, I did. It just didn't update. It's marked approved on my side. You may have to refresh your page. All right, so then 40936, which is the other Eric's proposal for char is ASCII. Was Eric on the call? I don't think so. But I guess, yeah, so it seems everybody seems to agree that that's a good idea from the people that discussed it on the issue, including me and Levi. Does anybody have any concerns with that?
What's the implementation of it? Is it literally less than or equal to 7F?
Yes. So the implementation is subject to change. But yes, it could be less than or equal to 7F or less than 8.0, depending on what we need it to do.
Yeah, my point is just we shouldn't expose it unless we have a good implementation of it. Like,
no, I mean that's the behavior will be the behavior between the two methods is identical. It's just the implementation, like the actual code gen, can change.
Yeah.
But the end user observable behavior is going to be documented as such.
Fits within 7 bits.
Yes.
makes sense.
The only thought that I had was how many of these APIs we have. We have rune.isASCII, we have ASCII.isASCII, and char is ASCII.
Yeah, that was actually discussed in the issue. The idea being that for simple and common accelerators like this, it's not the end of the world to actually duplicate them throughout the framework, because that way they're discoverable on whatever types you happen to be using.
Okay.
Like the char.isASCII method isn't going to take an int, for instance. It's going to take a char. The rune.isASCII method takes a rune, not a char, not an int. The ASCII.isASCII method takes all the different data types because it's kind of like the granddaddy of APIs.
That would be the one everybody else calls into. I mean, it's probably not going to be the way it is, but that's the way you could logically think of it.
Correct.
ASCII is like the main one, and then all the other ones are just convenience for your type that you
putting it in the place that you would look.
Yeah. Because we already have stuff like char.isLetter, char.isUpper, and so on. Like char. Sure, just put common accelerators on there. It makes sense.
Seems simple enough.
Yep.
Ship it.
All right, then we all in violent agreement, which should make me almost concerned. Are we okay with the parameter name ch? I guess that's all it is on char today, right?
Yeah, that matches all the other stuff.
That's what I thought. All right. So then the last one, environment is 32-bit process. We'll flip this.
There's another one I want to get to that I just put in chat. I thought it was on the docket.
So I think this one was flipped by Dan. So I didn't add him to the API review, but does anybody have any concerns with that?
Don't we already have? Oh no, we have is 64-bit. Sorry, we have is 64-bit operating system.
Yeah, so that was kind of my question. Is it not the same as not 64-bit? What would that do differently?
Well, because does 64-bit OS return true for WoW 64?
Well, it's is 64-bit process, right? So if you're running in 32-bit mode, then the answer would be no, right? It's not what the operating system is; it's what your process is.
We have both is 64-bit OS and is 64-bit process.
Would we not have is 32-bit OS to match?
I mean, it's not is 64-bit OS, right?
Why isn't this one not?
Yeah, that's
64-bit process.
I mean,
Wait,
it doesn't
what?
seem likely that we ever add 128-bit, right? So I don't know why we would not just do the negation.
Never say never, I guess.
I guess.
Yeah, I mean that.
Why would we add this one but not operating system? Is my question.
I don't think that people thought about it.
Yeah, like normally, like I definitely am a believer in it's really easy to get yourself in a trap of you have else and you assume else means exactly one thing and then it doesn't later.
Yeah, that Steve Tobe commented to that effect too. It's like what you're going to write is 32-bit process else is 64-bit process else fail fast.
Yeah, because as far as I know, and oh, Jan's not still on the call. He looks like he's still on the call on YouTube because
the
image is frozen. Somehow yours is moving, but his is frozen. I don't see us doing a 16-bit environment, even when that new old computer that Corey was excited about ships. So right now, given that we only have 32 and 64, it doesn't, and like nobody has a 128-bit computer, and we don't expect to ever go back and support a 16 or 8-bit computer. I don't know that it adds value other than now there's two different ways you can be set up for failure in the future.
Yeah.
Yeah, if we do get 128-bit computing in the future, we need to rethink this entire space anyway, and adding this property isn't going to change that fact.
Yeah. So
is quantum computing anything in here?
Yes, let's design it.
Is
we add a
6,002-bit computer?
We add a question mark to the end of the property name. That's quantum.
So I guess quantum would be if both is 32-bit and 64-bit return true, right? Because you're in a superposition of 32 and 64-bit.
Well, as Terry Pratchett says in Pyramids, quantum just means add a zero. So we would call it is 32-bit process 0, and now it's the quantum answer.
Is the foolproof, and there are air quotes around me saying foolproof, way of doing this, if you care about 128-bit, is to look at endpointer.size. However, I imagine that if we do get into that far-flung future, like endpointer probably needs to be reconsidered from the ground up as well, and as do all of our primitives.
Right. Well, because I mean, the question really is, what are you going to do with the information? And if it's that you're looking for a different DLL or whatever, then that is probably based on the notion of what's the pointer size. And if so, I think it doesn't add enough value, and that it's really just two different ways of asking the same question. And in the defensive case that they're talking about of why they want to propose it, then we're in a worse situation than we are if we have already added it. Because right now, every else thinks it's 32. And if we have a second supported way of doing this, then now every else means 64. And now we have two different buckets of problems when 16 or 128 comes online, or God forbid 96. 128 is too big. Let's do something in the middle.
Yeah.
Why does it have to be divisible by 8?
All right, you want to go real old school 7-bit, 13-bit? I don't know. But yeah, so I think that until we understand what a third case that we would support would look like, we can't answer this. Now, Win16 or .NET Framework 1 had this problem. It supported Win16, and I don't think it cared to have an answer for it. At least I remember seeing in string.get hash code, there was the #if32 where it was trying to say Win16 had a simpler solution, and then no one reevaluated that for Win64, and Win64 ran a much simpler get hash code algorithm than Win32 did, which was funny.
Yeah, that we got bitten by that a few times.
So API not approved?
Yeah, I would close
agree.
this unless there is
We got 8 minutes for mine, maybe.
Also, for the chat channel, it's obviously char, because CHAR is already a word. It means ash. And homonyms should always be homophones, because I say so. Otherwise, language is too hard.
My issue is abbreviations changing pronunciation. Like that's what gets me in my head.
Well, I mean, yeah. I used to care about SYNCH versus SYNC. SYNC is not a thing because it's the H is part of the sync in synchronous. But, I gave up on that a long time ago.
Good point.
I learned to bend like bamboo instead of be stiff like whatever the other thing in the proverb is.
Be water, my friend. Be water.
People.
All right. So this is another API proposal for the new connection abstractions. This is for connection listener, except async. Today, when you dispose a connection listener while in the middle of calling accept async, it has to throw. It presumably will throw like an operation cancel exception object dispose exception because the signature says that the connection can't be null. Generally, in servers like Kestrel, there's always an outstanding call to accept async, including when we dispose it. And what we've done using our internal abstractions is just return null in this case, and that ends the accept loop. And it's nice not to have a first chance exception for this kind of graceful shutdown behavior. So it'd be nice if accept async can return a value task of connection, which is nullable. And I've already had some discussion with like Jeff and Corey, and it seems like there's some support for this. Like with managed sockets, you're gonna end up throwing from like the inner call to accept async anyway, but perhaps with some other transports, you could avoid that exception.
Would this not be better if we just added a singleton connection dot closed connection and you return that instead of null? Because adding nulls to the world makes people sad.
But that's mostly because people don't expect them. Right now we have a type system where we can actually say this might be null.
I guess.
I mean, my biggest problem.
I think enumerable has a way to end. I'm kidding. It's fine.
Yes, let's completely redesign this.
I'm done trolling.
Enumerable right now.
I mean, my problem with null, with like these null value instances is that there's very few cases where this actually makes sense, right? I mean, like unless you have a really good null state that makes sense, like for example, an empty string you could argue is a really good representation for a null string most of the time. It's usually more trouble than it's worth because now you have more error states in your program.
I mean, the analogy here. Well, first of all, I think you're going to have an error state anyway, right? I mean, because today what happens is you always get an exception, so you're going to have to write a rapid try catch around that and specifically look for object dispose exception and say, oh, that means we shut down, and well, I hope it means we shut down and the object didn't suddenly dispose itself or something. So just follow that and pretend like everything's fine and go on. So the code's going to have to handle this one way or another, unless it's like trivial, prototype code. The question is just what's the best way to represent it. As Stephen said, the advantage of this is that you don't get an exception. You don't have to catch the exception. You don't have to know which exception you're going to get and all that sort of thing. You know exactly when it returns null. That means somebody disposed the listener, and so there's no more to be done here. It's analogous to like stream.read returning 0 on EOF, right? It just says, nope, no more, stop.
I guess, does it feel like a common problem to run into that? Like, I know that Christoph has a fun quote of people say exceptions are for exceptional behavior, but they're not. But my question here is it actually exceptional behavior to have disposed the thing while accept async has yet to finish? No. That feels super marginal to me, and introducing the notion of you need to check for null to see if it was this case feels like we're just putting a burden on people, when if we returned a singleton, if we were trying to avoid an exception of the performance problems with exceptions, then returning a singleton, I'm a useless connection, consider me that I was returned and then the dispose happened just after I was built, because you're going to have a race condition no matter what.
Yeah, but I mean, you can avoid the race condition by just always returning null when it's disposed, right?
Yep.
Well,
and this will happen to every listener. I wouldn't consider this marginal. Like every listener that's used in a normal way will hit this when it shuts down.
No, I think the race condition was between you guys checking whether it was disposed and determining to return null or not. Before I actually used the connection, it might have been disposed, right?
Yeah, unless you're locking in the bottom half of this thing so that you guarantee that your dispose is. So if you're locking in your dispose, then sure, I guess.
It's not the connection that is being disposed. It's the connection listener.
Right. So if connection listeners dispose is locking mutually exclusive with accept async instead of hitting a transient state, then sure. But if this is because I guess this is you're doing it inside the loop, like this is your loop method, right?
Yes.
Accept
async. Go do something with a connection. Go do another accept async.
Okay, so then all right. So now it makes more sense to me why dispose would come into play. I was looking at this as you set the thing up, you configure a few properties, you say go, and it's a one-time operation. That it's like I'm now listening, but this is listen once, not listen or begin the notion of listening.
Right. It's not returning, like David suggested, an async enumerable of connections, because then we would know when it ended.
So what is?
So this is it returns when in TCP land when SYNAC is done and you have a connection. This isn't put the OS in the state where the port is open.
Right. Yeah. There's another listen call from the listener factory that gives you the listener that does that.
So I think I was conflating this with listen, and so it felt very marginal to me to hit this case. But if this is the ongoing loop thing, it makes a lot more sense.
So what is the else clause? Like, so if I say if connection is not null, what would I write in the else?
Else return. We're done. No more to like the somebody shut down the listener by calling dispose on it, and so there's no more work for me to do in terms of accepting new connections.
Right. So there will be an accept loop method that will exit gracefully once it sees the null connection, because that's to the loop that you're shutting down, or the listener shut down.
Yeah, you break out of your loop.
In that case, I think I'm in favor of nullable and not some weird singleton.
Yeah, like I thought that this was it gets called once method, and I thought the null was introducing more complexity than it was worth, but in the loop thing, that makes a lot more sense.
Right.
And I don't think it's about performance. It's more about just the hassle of having an exception, you know? People see first chance exceptions and go, sometimes they break on them in the debugger, and then they're like, oh, wait, this is getting caught. I didn't really need to deal with this. You know, and then they have to write the try catch to deal with it. You know, it's not a huge deal either way. It just seems like that this is, because it's really not exceptional in any way. Pretty much every piece of code that does the server is going to write an accept loop, and every single accept loop is going to have to deal with. And so everybody's going to hit this. They're either going to throw and have to do a try catch, or they're just going to null and don't see an exception, at least at that level.
Yeah. Yeah. Now that I have reloaded networking terminology, I 100% agree. This is a normal behavior of we've stopped listening before someone connected, and that's normal. And as your analogy to read line makes perfect sense. Of we're not coming back from this either, or of socket.read. So
yep,
sounds good then. So I guess we're done for today.
Great.
And that's a rewrite for 5.
This is for 5.
Yeah.
Sounds good. Then see you guys next week, unless something urgent pops up.
Hooray.
All right. Bye-bye.
Adios.